I love slavery. Absolutely love slavery. I love slavery so much I'd sleep with slavery if I could. In fact, I was in the state legislature yesterday, and I stood up and I said, slavery, 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 slavery. Thank you. And I sat down and sipped my tea, thought a little bit more about slavery. When I went to bed that night, I dreamt of nothing but slavery. You know, when I'm in town, I always pass out slavery cards that say John Smith, slave owner since 1844. And you should see our Constitution down here. Every word in that document says slavery, from the first word to the last. And we'll do whatever it takes to preserve our peculiar institution. This is exactly how people view Southerners in the 1840s and the 1850s, the antebellum South. So I thought I'd do a video today talking about the Georgia slave laws, 1755 to 1860. Highly encourage you to go to the Georgia Archive site to take a look at this for yourselves. Don't forget, we also had indentured servitude at this time. Now, indentured servants primarily were white European immigrants, usually came from Eastern or Southern Europe, and they entered into indentured servitude to pay off the debt of their travel. But just like slaves, indentured servants could be captured and resold if they tried to skip out of the contract or even fled from the plantation. Because, yes, you did have indentured servants working alongside slaves on these plantations. If you moved to the South or immigrated to the South, where do you think the work was? It was in the fields. It was on the plantations because all the factories were up north. By the way, if you hear any background noise, that's my slave working in my garden or doing stuff around the house. I'm just joking, folks. I'm just joking. So here's the legal status of slaves. This is their wording. Remember, 1755 to 1860. Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, or mestizos. Mestizos is somebody of Spanish and indigenous origin. Here are the legal responsibilities of slave owners. The overseer, the white family member, etc., white employee. It says here in quotes, having charge or government of slave. According to colonial law, penalties for white offenders included fines, whipping, or corporal punishment for slaves. In 1817, with the introduction of county jails and state penitentiaries, penalties for white offenders included imprisonment, and they classified a white person or white free person as usually male. And white free person could also qualify as somebody who's an immigrant from Europe. And they used, quote-unquote, person of color to describe slaves or freemen. Now, slaves were required to have passes, permits, or tickets if they were going to leave the plantation, go out of town, and they could not leave unaccompanied. And that pass or ticket or letter had to be signed by their master. And a white person could apprehend a slave not meeting this criteria. White person could also be fined for forging a ticket for another person's slave. You could not have any more than 7 slaves traveling unaccompanied by a white person. The owner of a plantation with 25 slaves over the age of 16 had to retain 1 white man capable of bearing arms. Failure to do so resulted, now they did this in pounds rather than dollars, according to colonial law. So anybody who did not have at least 1 white man on their property who had 25 slaves over the age of 16, they would be fined 5 pounds. Now this was modified in 1823 to 10 or more slaves over 16, expanded to bearing arms to the overseer, manager, superintendent, same fine. Crimes of the masters, white persons regarding slaves, beating, maiming, disabling slaves, concealing or conveying away a slave accused of a crime to avoid trial. A master could be fined up to 200 pounds for capital crimes. It was also against the law to employ slaves to work on the Sabbath, to sell beer or liquor to slaves, or even give them beer or liquor. You know what I say? You have these poor slaves working 12, 15, 16 hours a day. Give them a few beers at the end of the day. A couple shots of liquor. Give them a really nice meal. It's also against the law to hire slaves without a ticket from the master. You could be fined for that. working slaves more than 16 hours per day, denying sufficient clothing, shelter, food, harboring or entertaining runaway slaves, stealing slaves, allowing slaves to beat drums or blow horns. Here are the crimes of slaves. You could not rent, hire out any house, room, store, or plantation on your own account. Whites permitting this were fined. You could not administer medicine to any slave except on direction of white person. Employing or using a slave in a drugstore where they're compounding or selling pharmaceuticals that had to be supervised. Slave committing crime except felony by command of master, owner, or overseer is not guilty, but the master is, according to an 1811 law. Homicide a white person except in the case of misadventure or self-defense. Willfully burning a stockpile of grain, rice, corn, tar kiln, or barrels of pitch, turpentine, or rosin. Stealing goods or chattel whatsoever. Deluding or enticing any slave to run away. Poisoning any person. Instructing another slave in the knowledge of poisons. Insurrection. And I'm going to clean up the language on this next one here. Assault or attempted assault on a free white female. Maiming or assaulting with attempt to murder a white person. Arson of any kind. And finally, murder of another slave or free person of color. These last four were put under the Capital Crimes Act of 1770. So these are the Georgia slave laws, 1755 to 1860. And these would most likely have applied to other slaveholding states and areas in the North because you did have certain pockets of slavery that still existed, despite states in the North abolishing slavery. Not all states or territories belonging to the Union necessarily abolished slavery, and they didn't do it overnight. It's done through a process known as gradual emancipation. A lot of times, it wasn't the living slaves that were freed, but their children, their offspring. Once that offspring reached 25 to 27 years of age, depending on whether or not the offspring was male or female. But I thought I'd bring this to your attention today because there were guardrails in place regarding slavery. I'm glad, like I said before, that we no longer have this institution or Jim Crow. But it was not the wild, wild west of slavery. And as I mentioned in my last video, because everyone keeps coming back to the same question, did the South secede because of slavery? In my last video, I said no. You had conflicts with Spain. You had this fight between the power of the federal government and the states, whether they be a free state or not. And you had abolitionists calling for the free states to secede. 1857. This was also my last video. You had William Lloyd Garrison, along with a little-known minister at the time named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And Higginson would go on to fund John Brown, his abolitionist movement. But they held a convention over this. They were calling for the free states to secede. So imagine if that had happened in late 1857, 1858. We may not even have had a civil war. And you'd have free states on their own, slave states on their own. This is what I think would have happened. I think eventually slavery would have died out because a lot of part of the 19th century was a time of invention. Remember, this was the Victorian era. First part of the century, you had the locomotive, you had photography, you had the telegraph. A lot of part of the century, you had the telephone, you had the phonograph, you had streetcars, and shipbuilding was starting to advance in technology. So the ship was king on the high seas. So if you enjoyed the video, please click that like button, subscribe, hit me up on Instagram at hashtag Jason Composes, leave comments below, and now you can reach me at Twitter, Voice of the Composer at Twitter. So in closing here, when we take a look back at that time period, we need to stop trying to look at this through a 20th century lens, or 21st century lens. We need to look at this through the eyes of somebody who lived in the 19th century. And actually, groups like the Irish, the Italians, even some of the Germans, these poor groups from Europe, say the poor English, they were all lumped into the same economic and social class along with the black population. I always love telling people that back in the day, musicians, because I love music, talking about music on the series, musicians were often seen on the same level as the kitchen staff back in the days of the nobility. 100% true. 100% true. Musicians seen on the same level as a kitchen staff. And thanks to the free market and this thing called the United States of America, we now have corporations, we now have people being able to go into business for themselves. People are able to build wealth. But I'm just glad we don't live in a time of slavery. But at that time, that was the labor industry. That's how you got work, was you worked on the plantation, in the fields, in the factories. Believe it or not, it was long days in the factories too. You had a lot of child labor. That's why we came up with child labor laws. So I will catch you next time. Voice of the Composer saying, peace out, stay safe, everybody, and God bless this great country.